Hello, everyone. Hope you're all right and hope you enjoyed listening to our first episode on the Rare Earth series. If you haven't, please check that out because we are coming up with our second episode soon. And now, welcome to another episode of From the Ground Up, a University of Chicago public policy podcast produced at Harris School of Public Policy. In the studio with me today is Adidapo Aziz
Always a pleasure to be here.
and Hugo He.
Hello.
And today, Hugo is bringing us a very, very special guest, Professor Sarah Mills, who is the Associate Professor of Practice in Urban Policy and Regional Planning with University of Michigan. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Hugo.
Yeah. As Karan have said, Professor Sarah Mill holds the position of Associated Professor of Practice in Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Michigan. Go Blue.
Go Blue.
She also served as the director of the Center for Empowering Communities within the Grant Sustainability Institute. Her current works focus on how renewable energy development impacts rural community both positively and negatively, and the disparate reactions of rural landowners to wind and solar projects, as well as how state and local practice facilitates or hinders renewable energy deployment. Professor Mills, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit?
Well, I think that you went over the kind of stuff that I do. I think maybe it's helpful for people to know that I got into this place, or like my academic background is first in engineering. I did mechanical engineering as an undergrad, and then my master's is in engineering for sustainable development. And my PhD is in farmland preservation, which is within urban planning. For fun, I serve on the planning commission in the city of Ann Arbor. And so talk a lot about kind of land use in an urban context.
Yeah. You talk about a little bit about your background, which is kind of connected to our first questions, actually. When I was doing some research about you, I find a testimony you wrote before the Michigan State Senate when the siting bill was taken up, and you mentioned that you were being an art academic. So I guess can you first tell us a little bit about what the siting bill is about, but also I think why do you mention yourself as an art academic?
Sure. So what the testimony was about and kind of what the siting bill was about. Last fall, so fall of 2023, there were a package of bills that were moving through the Michigan legislature that did a lot of things. It was like comprehensive energy legislation. One of them created a clean energy standard. We had previously had a renewable portfolio standard that had effectively expired, and it was pretty weak sauce. It was 15% renewables, which we've achieved, but that's not where we need to be in terms of climate action. So this package of bills increased substantially the both renewable portfolio standard and established 100% clean energy standard by 2040. It changed some of the rules associated with distributed generation, net metering, rooftop solar kind of stuff. It put some targets for energy storage, but in order to achieve any of those things, one of the bills that was taken up was specifically about who gets to decide how renewable energy projects are sited. And this is something that has been under consideration or discussed as problematic in Michigan for some time, but it's not just Michigan. This kind of who ought to have the authority for siting renewable energy is a policy that lots of states are taking up, including in Illinois. They did it a year before us. So what the siting bill was about was moving from Michigan has currently has, I guess, hyper-local siting authority. So not just counties, but in rural areas, it's sub-county units called townships. And many of those townships were saying no to renewable energy. And so the siting bill effectively provided developers who wanted to site large projects. It only applies to 50 megawatts for solar and storage or 100 megawatts for wind. So developers who want to site those large projects, another option to go directly to the Michigan Public Service Commission, which is it's our Public Utilities Commission, we call it the Public Service Commission, to effectively go to them to get land use approval rather than work through the local government. So because my work is studying and has historically been helping local governments as they're setting zoning, this is a topic that I think about a lot. So that's the background on what the bill was. And my test, yes, absolutely.
If I may, for the listeners, can we also have some clarity on what do we exactly mean by siting? Because I think it would be great to have some nuance to that.
Sure. So right now in the kind of clean energy space, there's permitting, which tends to be like federal kind of discussion about like NEPA and a lot on transmission issues and siting, which this is what a lot of states are taking up that I would say is specifically about zoning. It's the land use approval. Who gets to decide how close wind turbines are allowed to be sited near a house or a property line or a road? And in what parts of a community, large ground-mounted wind or solar projects are allowed to be sited. So that's what we mean by siting. In most places, like the authorities that determine land use authority, like they do it through zoning authority. So and with some few exceptions of Oregon, like that tends to be a very local function. In the energy space, because you folks are energy folks, historically, oil and gas development, actually, I'm going to pause for a minute. You're public policy people. You know that like local governments are creatures of the state. And from state to state, they're sometimes what local government, like the state gets to control effectively what things it does and what things local governments do. And sure, there's like Dillon's rule and home rule states, but effectively, like it's the state that's kind of calling the shots. And so in many situations, in actually most states, siting for oil and gas infrastructure, like wells, drilling wells and that kind of thing, very oftentimes the state says that's not something that local zoning authorities can deal with. Sometimes they can deal with like infrastructure surrounding it. Oftentimes that is the rules associated with whether or not you can have an oil well are reserved for the state. That's not been the case for wind and solar, for large wind and solar. And right now it's about half and half across the country of states that have said, like, nope, we're taking that authority on ourselves, the state is, or we're going to leave it up to, and then the other half effectively says we're going to leave it up to local governments. Sometimes it's super complicated where both state and local governments, you have to get a permit from both of them. So that's like effectively 2 points of veto. And sometimes it is, up to the local government within kind of constraints posed by the state. So that's what I mean by siting.
Yeah. And, I imagine that the state government takes control of most of siting regulation for oil wells because of how important it is and how dangerous it can be. So as renewable energy becomes more important, do we expect that state governments will continue to press to, take control of siting and take those powers from the local governments?
Yes. And so I think historically, one of the reasons for having oil and gas activities done at the state level, some of it is because for safety reasons, right? If you've got regulators who do this all the time, then they can kind of be making sure that it's safe. Another reason that historically that this has been a state function is because it's been really important economically, right? Remember, like our economy has been built on energy development, and for oil and gas in particular, it's not every place has oil and gas deposits. So the sense has been you can't let communities that are sitting on this opportunity for economic development and prosperity to effectively say, nope, we're gonna leave it in the ground, right? Like that has historically been the precedent for oil and gas. The second part, like your analysis on the second part, was super right on, which is as states are passing policies requiring additional renewables, requiring decarbonization, whether through renewables specifically or through clean energy standards, what they're seeing is like, it requires that we're going to need to get more power more electricity from renewable sources. And if we have too many communities saying no, that's going to make it harder to achieve those goals, or more costly to achieve those goals. One of the projects that I'm working on is to try to put a number on that, because if you're in the state's position, this is a controversial move from a state's position to preempt local control, to take power that wasn't vested in the local government and now say, like, nope, we're the state going to take that on ourselves. And so one of the projects that I've been working on is with an energy modeler to try to understand, what is the cost implication when the windiest places say no to wind energy, right? Then the wind developers go to the next windy places. And if the capacity factors, I'm assuming that you guys know energy stuff, capacity factors, like how often? Yeah, okay, great. I'm not going to get into those weeds. If the capacity factors are lower, then it is going to be more costly, but like how much more costly? And this is one of the things where it's a little bit different now that we're talking about solar, because solar resource viability isn't that different across the state of Illinois or across the state of Michigan, right? And so there's lots of places that are viable. What makes them more viable is whether they already have transmission and there's space on the transmission lines. And if you've got a substation, like that's kind of the big difference. But we're working on some projects to try to quantify that. And so it's not published yet, but one of the things that I do, because I've studied this zoning stuff, we have a database of all of the rural zoning ordinances, or 90% of the rural zoning ordinances in the 6 Great Lakes states. So from Minnesota over to Ohio, there's 28 different zoning units in rural places. So we're not even talking about the cities and villages. And we've collected them all and read them all to see if they include solar, like if they regulate for utility scale solar. And if they do, then kind of what are the rules that they're putting in place? Like very few are saying absolutely no solar at all. More commonly, they're saying, yeah, you can do solar, but not on farmland, which ultimately has the effect of blocking a project, or saying you can do solar, but you need to set back 500 feet from the road, which similarly makes it just more expensive. It puts additional barriers on.
Yeah, so I guess our next question, which is what we have.
Just before we go on to that, I
Yeah.
just want to quickly get your answer about why you stay yourself as an all academic, real quick.
Oh, why I'm an odd academic?
Yeah.
Sure. So the reason that I call myself an odd academic is that I don't publish very often, like academic papers. I instead do things like write this guide for local governments that's a fill in the blank zoning ordinance. It's kind of what they need to know about, and like solar energy in this case, and then a kind of a fill in the blank guide for how you would regulate it. I spend an awful lot of my time standing in rural communities before planning commissions or the county board and talking about the pros and cons of renewables. And further, I think I'm an odd academic in the energy space because I didn't get into this studying energy. Like I come at energy from a rural land use perspective. My PhD was trying to understand farmland preservation, and I ended up studying wind development inadvertently. And I studied it because it was being talked about by planners as a farmland preservation tool. So that's why I'm an odd academic. I get out of the ivory tower an awful lot.
And yeah, you have, laid out to us how some local governments have more appetite towards accepting renewable energy projects other than more than others. And it'll be interesting to, understand why there are these differences. Why are some locals, not very accepting of this project, even though in some ways it might benefit them?
So this is the place where I do actually have an academic paper with Doug Bissett, who's at Michigan State. The title of our paper is called Farmers versus Lakers, and it's trying to understand like whether you can predict opposition to wind energy using landscape characteristics. Because standing in those rural places, I was seeing like some places were very accepting, like they have a wind project and they're saying like we want more, and others were like we don't want this at all, or one is enough for us. And what we found in the wind space was that, again, the title is Farmers versus Lakers, so where there are more farmers, wind is less contentious. The reason, we believe, is that wind is seen as just another way to have that farmland be productive. These are places, right, like many of the communities that have oil and gas development, where like the land is meant to be worked, right? On the other side, where there are lots of lakers, which it's not just the Great Lakes that we share, but we have a lot of inland lakes, and the USDA has this natural amenities score. Your higher natural amenities in the USDA's mind when you are closer to bodies of water and you are not flat, right? So rolling hills. And in Michigan, this is where people have cottages and like they like to retire to those like scenic places. And in those places where there are lakers, or more specifically to the research, where the county scores higher on that natural amenity scale, wind is more contentious. And of course it is, because it is a change to that landscape. Modern wind turbines are 500, 600 feet tall. And so it is a change. And so this is one of the reasons why communities are responding differently to the same technology, is because it's thinking about how that technology fits in the landscape. And honestly, there's increasing, and then how it changes someone's sense of place. If you have an identity around like, this place is to be productive versus this place is to enjoy the scenery, right? You're going to see the technology differently. And one more thing, and then I'll be quiet and you can ask your next question, which is in a lot of rural places, and I'll say in Michigan, and I'm not 100% sure what it's like in Chicago or in Illinois, but you have farmers versus lakers living right next to each other. In Michigan, you are never more than 6 miles from a body of water. And so we have some people that are there for the, that are farmers, or that are there for the productive qualities of the landscape, and other people that are there because they wanted to move out of the city and enjoy the night sky. And so this is where we see differences. We tried to replicate that research on wind with solar and didn't find quite the same patterns, in part, I think, because we were too early. So like solar has changed a lot in terms of what it's looked like, the scale of what it's looked like across the Midwest. But this idea of a change to the landscape, when we're talking about a solar farm that is on average coming to the state of Michigan a couple square miles, 1,300 acres on average is kind of the average size solar farm that's in the MISO queue. A lot of the reactions are about kind of how this land use fits into their sense of place.
Christian, you had a question, right?
That was more of a comment. Thank you for that insight. For clarity to our listeners, taking all of that, would you say it's more about how the renewable energy fits into the existing culture of a region or a place? And I say that because I'm from Texas. I've worked in industry going on 15 years now. And I've traveled from Tennessee to Colorado to here out in the Midwest. And Dapo and I recently attended the Better in Our Backyard conference in Duluth, Minnesota. And a lot of these a lot of these issues between locals and development differ from region to region. For example, the example that you made with regard to Michigan is a very similar example of what is going on in Minnesota. There are a lot of lakes there, and the people of Minnesota want to preserve, as you said, the scenic landscape for their excursions or retirement or whatever have you, to preserve the environment so that they can return there. Whereas down in Texas, and you made an example, and I have pictures of many oil derricks and wind farms right next to each other across farmland. And it's what we do back home. We work the land. And so I think about that, and I think of other projects that I've worked on that have, failed for siting, for permitting, like R&D projects. That doesn't fit into tilling the soil. That doesn't fit into working the land. It was like you're drilling a hole in the ground to create a hyperloop for no one here, so nobody here wants it. And then so it begs the question of, at least for me, is like, where does the authority of the state stepping in, where does it violate the rights of the locals and what they actually want? And so that's a contention of mine, because yes, I am sure all of us here on this podcast would love to reduce our climate impact. But on the other hand, we also want to respect the homes of others, and what right is it of us to tell them how they should live, what business they should develop. On another note, yesterday I was at a conference here in Chicago in the Loop, and a gentleman that works, he's the CEO of a renewable energy company, and I will not name names, but he was talking about the same frustration coming from a developer, saying that I just can't build here because I can't be on this land. And he referred to the locals in his frustration as Joe Blows in the middle of nowhere. And I looked up and I was like, well, if they were in this room, you aren't winning hearts and minds, man. And there's no social license to operate coming towards you in any case, if you've ever said that. And I definitely, just because you said that, would not want you to build on my land at all. So it's a unique perspective. And so where do you think that the state coming in and dictating where renewable development should be done violates or intrudes on the rights of local citizens and landowners?
Just to jump in, I should also say that there's an important point, not only about like developers, but we, students are in the school, and we're talking about distance from an academic sense, but we're not really on the ground. We're not really right there with people who are, experiencing the consequences of these big ideas that we have. And I think that's what's usually lost, because there's a disconnection between the people in, an office room, in a research lab, making these big ideas, and the people who have been doing this work for a very long time. And now we're going there and telling them, we have to change your lives for the future that we want to build, right? If I was them, I would be dissatisfied too, if it doesn't fit with exactly the kind of future that I envision. So where do we draw the line? Where the governments come in, where the professionals come in, and do these things in a way that respects the wish of the locals, and what have you heard from them? What do they want from academics and professionals and government workers to have a more respectful and considerable relationship?
This is exactly where I want to pick up, because what they want is respect. And how I think about this, and this is why I'm a weirdo in this space, because I don't come at it from a climate or an energy perspective. I come at it from a rural person's perspective. Like, I grew up at the end of a dirt road, and I might live in a city right now that's declared a climate emergency, but I know the conversation around my work with renewable energy at Thanksgiving dinner isn't the conversation that's happening in Ann Arbor. So, Christian, what you said about culture, I think, is right on. And again, like, I'm gonna answer your questions, but I'm gonna and go back to like citing and specifically about policy. But I think what is really important to acknowledge is, like, it's different from place to place. And so as you were talking, right, this is now gonna wind around a little bit, but a class that I teach at University of Michigan is on the web of state policies affecting renewables deployment. everybody thinks about renewable portfolio standards and carbon taxes. I imagine that, University of Chicago, like you guys got that too. But what is not commonly taught, and what we talk about in this class, is siting authority, right? It matters to renewables deployment. Tax policy, property tax policy. You don't want to cut all taxes on renewables if you want to see them, because honestly, that's why a rural community says yes to renewable energy. It's for the economic benefits that come along with it. And so, sure, the federal government can cut taxes, but like, you don't, and maybe you want to cut state taxes, but you don't want to cut local taxes. And developers will tell you that, like, in places where it's low local taxes, they give additional community benefits, because you got to, like, that is the value proposition for communities to host a large wind or solar farm. But in addition to like thinking about this web of policies, one of the things, like the very last class, we talk about like what are the different recipes that have led to renewables deployment across the country. And the Texas recipe, which is an all of the above strategy, like sure, it had a renewable portfolio standard early on, but like it's meaningless now. And like there were symbolic votes to like repeal it, right? It's different because it's very much about like we're gonna make sure that local governments can use tax policy and use the authority that they have on siting to like get what they want out of the energy system, because that's the ethos that fits here. That recipe in Texas is quite different than the New York recipe, which is effectively like, we have a climate emergency. We are not seeing enough communities saying yes. And so the state is going to decide where renewables project goes. And yes, there will be some considerations given to local governments, but it's different. And politically also though, like New York is not Texas, right? Is not Nebraska, is not Michigan. Like we're all kind of unique. And there are some patterns that we can pick up. And in my class, we talk about like, not one of these recipes is better necessarily than the other. It's just what fits in your place. I said that because you talked about siting authority, and and Michigan is not Texas, and Michigan is not New York, right? It's a purple place. It's a place where we do have like a strong history of local control for land uses. And in light of a state policy that calls for more renewables, you have to think about like, how do you get there? And so you can, and the state did effectively say, we're going to change policy and have an option for for developers to come right to the state government. As I talked about in my class, that's not the only option. There's a couple other options out there that operate differently. One could be, instead, let's throw money at this and make it worth more communities' time, like effort and time, right? So you can incentivize, and actually the state has put $30 million of incentives this year to communities who want to host more than their fair share of energy infrastructure, right? Like large projects. Like that's one approach. We've been actually trying to build the groundwork for this over the course of the last few years. And that actually, Hugo, you mentioned my testimony, like what I was trying to let the legislators know is what we have been doing, which is working on providing templates and going to communities and trying to get them to be proactive. Because I think one of the big reasons that we have communities have a knee-jerk reaction to no is that it's not their idea. They haven't thought about it until a developer showed up. And when the developer is showing up with shiny shoes from Chicago or some other place and saying, have I got something to sell you? Even if it's a really good thing, it's often seen skeptically. And I can say as a planning commissioner that once the development is put on a map, people have different feelings about it than when we talk about the development in general, right? Like this is not just an Ann Arbor thing. This is a pretty common thing where like overall people recognize we need to have more development in our cities, right? We are going to increase density, but maybe not in like on the block next to me, or certainly not in my backyard. And honestly, it's the construction activity that really sends life into a tizzy. And that's true for housing development, and it's also true for renewables. And so trying to get communities to determine ahead of time where they think, if they think renewables are beneficial to them and where they fit has been what we're trying to get at. The problem is it's hard to get communities to like act when there's not an emergency. And so the kind of happy medium, which actually is the like make everybody mad policy, but the force the conversation on communities is another policy option, another siting policy option that I'll say hasn't been tried in the renewable space, but I think it holds merit, which is telling every community, you got to do your fair share. We're all in this together. We all use electricity, right? We all have some potential, and you got to figure out where it is that you can do your fair share, which technology works and where you want it. And if you empower communities to do that ahead of time, like I think first of all, it forces that conversation so they're not in a reflective mode, but also it is not forcing on them a project that is way more than their fair share, because this now is getting back to the kind of heart of the question. Like the community, so in a lot of the states where large scale renewables have been developed, it's not been that it's been a local decision. It hasn't gone to the state, right? It hasn't been forced on these communities. They are seeing, and I believe in many cases, renewable energy development is the biggest opportunity that some of these communities have seen in decades. It doesn't, I'll be clear, I had a group of students work with Resources for the Future on their master's project. And in terms of like dollars per acre, it doesn't have the same kind of money that oil and gas development has. It can't replace that. But it's new places. And it's a diversified income stream, right? And so the places that have said yes so far, it's because it's beneficial to them. I think that there's a couple of things happening. One, it's moving to places, like some of those low-hanging fruit places have already been developed. So it's moving closer to people, or to people who are more like the Lakers than the farmers. But also it's just the speed. Like there's this urgency now that there wasn't 10 years ago. And it's catching rural communities off guard. And there's a whole bunch of push, I think, from people to say, let's just like, there's nothing wrong with these projects. Like what? But you wouldn't have people being so upset if they're like there's impacts. There are local impacts. And I would say it's just not viewshed impacts. Like there's noise associated. Like you think about wind turbine noise, but the inverter of a solar farm is not silent. And so,
Professor, I just wanted to ask you a couple of questions along these lines. So
Yeah.
the first part that I wanted to ask you is, because you have done research on the matter, I just wanted to understand, what did your research indicate? Did your research indicate a trend towards those states harboring oil and gas companies and their facilities being more resistant to accepting of renewable energy projects? Or did you not see a correlation to that? Because sometimes, because it is in the hands of the local government to approve certain renewable energy projects, or a reasonable person may tend to think that it may just be influenced by the oil and gas lobby working in that state to also dissuade the community and the local government to actually approve the projects. That's one. The second part is, you spoke about incentives being offered to the community. I just wanted to understand, what is the structure of these incentives? Because I, much like many other listeners, would tend to believe that if there are millions of dollars coming our way as a community, I would be happy, relatively happy, to receive it at a particular cost. But do you think that is the incentivization the problem, or the structuring of the incentive the problem? For instance, the local government gets to decide how to apply those incentives, or the community has whole and sole discretion to decide how to apply those, or the households would be getting certain percentages of the proceeds of incentives? So yes, those are the two questions for you, Professor.
all right. So the first question about oil and gas, I'll tell you that most of my own work has been in the Midwest, where there's just not the same kind of oil and gas interests. So I haven't specifically looked at it. There is work out of effectively coal country. So Sean has been Smith has done some work in, don't get me lying, Montana, Wyoming, has done kind of work in that part of the country that effectively finds attitudes about renewables. Like this is not just seen as an all of the above, that there is seen as some kind of competition between the two. And I think it is Wyoming that effectively, like the state there's some policies that effectively suggest we're not super open to renewables because we do think it's competition with what has been our bread and butter. There's some of that. But then you also have Texas. And in Texas, again, not the expert, like I'm going to defer to Christian here, but goes back and forth a bit about whether they are in all of the above, or policy-wise, maybe we do see kind of new energy as competing a little bit. And so it's different, and it's not my area of study, but I'll just say, I think that we see different things in different parts of the country associated with that. And more work certainly could be done on that. In terms of the incentives, this is also one where it varies greatly from state to state. I talked already a little bit about property taxes, because I'll just say in Europe, where there's not really property taxes, it's very common for renewable energy developers to have community benefits agreements, because they know that they need to have something in it for the local government. That's historically been less common in the States because the community-wide economic benefit has been in property taxes. It varies from state to state about what the structure of that tax is. And even within a state, we're going to get slightly wonky. You can look this up if you're not a property tax scholar, but in a state where there's an ad valorem structure and it's based on local tax rates, local millage rates, a wind farm in one community might be paying different taxes than in a different community. And some states have explicitly authorized effectively negotiation. So payment in lieu of taxes, PILTs, pilots, what your part of the country, it kind of depends. I do have a paper on this, effectively finding in Michigan, it's an ad valorem tax. So there's not really negotiation. But the problem is those tax benefits are invisible to the people that live in the community that host wind farms. So we went to 10 different places that have wind farms and asked them, did your local services improve as a result of wind development? Like, improved or worsened? Nobody said they worsened, blessedly. But generally speaking, like 25% of people said that local services improved, which is crazy, because in of the 10 townships, the township with the smallest increase, like their tax revenues went up 20% as a result of wind development. In the place with the largest increase, their property tax revenues quintupled. They went up 550 some percent. 30% of people there said that their local services improved. The township supervisor was like, of course, like we paved these we were able to do dust mitigation a couple extra times last year as a result of wind development. Like we paved an extra bit of road, but like local people don't know what it costs to keep local services going, right? And so there was one outlier in this data, which was a township where 60% of the revenue of the residents said that their township services improved. Their tax revenues only doubled. So it's not quintupled, they just doubled. Township used the wind tax revenue to introduce trash collection, right? And so it was a tangible new service that the residents saw, because before they had to do that individually or just take their stuff to the county dump. My hypothesis that I have not been able to get somebody to fund me to test is that when it's negotiated, when the benefits are negotiated, it is more visible, because there's there can be a community conversation about that. So we don't know that. Nobody's tried that. There's been some research effectively on how schools benefit from wind and solar revenue. And the punchline is, it depends from state to state, because how schools are funded varies. But nobody's really tested this, like, does negotiating the payments with people make it more visible? One more observation, Karen, to your point here. is that these tend to be, when you ask people on surveys, they tend to say, I want community benefits. Like, I don't need individual benefits. But I don't know. Like, the community benefits are not always felt. And if the thing that goes into the community benefit is not something that you care about, doesn't matter, right? So to this end, the state of New York, a couple of years ago, when it changed its siting authority, they had a whole big energy overhaul too. They effectively moved siting authority from local governments to the state government, but at the same time instituted a statewide community benefits approach that required developers to pay money into a fund that would then provide rebates, utility bills to people in the vicinity. I think it's interesting. It's an interesting approach. It's something that people anecdotally have told me, like, if wind and solar are great, like, why am I still paying my electricity bill? And why isn't this not like Alaska, where I get a revenue check in the mail, right? I think one of the critiques of the approach in New York State is that it's pretty small. So people are getting like a couple dollars off of their utility bill every month. And also, like, I don't think that people are reading their utility bills to know that they're getting it. So I think that there ought to be other iterations on that. I was going to say one final thing, and this is like again, I don't think that this is the approach very often, but how I would change things is that I would love to go into a community and say, what's on your bucket list? What would you really like to see here? What would make this place better? And then I would like to see, like, have the conversation, how much energy development would it take to get you that thing? One of my informed hypotheses, I guess, is that the reason there's money in renewables across the board, but the reason that some people are reticent is that it's not, like, some of these places first don't want local revenues to grow because they're small government places. And so, like, local government getting bigger ain't necessarily a benefit. The other thing is, the things that developers want to throw money at may not be the things that the community actually thinks money should be thrown at. And so I think when you can have energy development being the solution to your problem, like getting you the thing that you want, rather than the energy development being the problem, like, we got to figure out how to site this thing, like, that changes the conversation entirely. But making our conversation go full circle, that's really hard in an environment where we feel a rush.
So I guess we can also go a little more about like the practical sides of your work, where you kind of mentioned in a lot of your writing that a major solution that you are advocating for is that each community, both urban and rural, should contribute fairly to the challenge of decarbonizations. How that will be work for the urban community, because we mentioned a lot about the rural community, and a lot of the larger sizes siting project will be only possible in the rural community area. So I'm wondering if this is one solution that you are advocating for, how that will work in the urban side.
I'm going to wear my, like, I don't know, walk in the line hat. Is that, like, it's an idea. I try not to advocate. I try to identify where there are feelings and where the research would suggest, like, we might need to, like, think about things differently. I'm going to start out, and you can cut this if you want, but I'm going to start out by helping you understand why, right? So in states where they have policies, where they're moving to change siting policy, usually it's only for the largest projects. And those largest projects are pretty much then, like, the line that they put for, you know, which projects would fall under state siting, those largest projects are only in rural areas. And especially in states where you have a legislature that is controlled by urban interests rather than rural interests, like, this is where you get concerns over urban folks setting policies that really only apply in rural areas. There's excellent research out of New York State on the case by Robbie Nilsson. She's a postdoc researcher at Lawrence Berkeley Lab. but she was looking at solar, and it's talking about the rural burden and how rural folks feel like they are being asked to shoulder this burden. And I have heard anecdotally the same thing, in wind space too. And the reality is, like, we all do use energy. So what is possible in an urban area? Now I'm going to come back to your actual question, right? Well, first of all, like, strictly in the electricity space, we could be maximizing rooftop solar. And often it is not local government policy that's standing in the way of rooftop solar. It's utility policy or utilities who don't want it. I want to acknowledge that. But sometimes there are urban places who say you can't have solar panels on road-facing roofs. That's ridiculous, especially if that's a city that has declared a climate emergency. And I'm not going to throw any cities under the bus, but we got one of those in Michigan. We've got another one in Michigan that's declared a climate emergency that allows garages in people's, if they've got an extra big front yard, they allow garages there, but they don't allow ground-mounted solar panels because they're worried about property values. And come on, give me a break. Like, that's not being consistent. So that's within the electricity space. And if you want to know what you can do to incentivize rooftop solar, the Department of Energy has a program for this. It's called Soul Smart, a great checklist, like all of the things that urban places can do. If you still stay in the delivered fuel spaces or kind of electricity space, urban places also have opportunities for geothermal. Like, you don't have to be like the West. We are, again, not a geothermal expert, but I can tell you that this is actively, like, this is University of Michigan's approach to decarbonization, is trying to get our heating accomplished through geothermal. So that would go a long way to making a dent in our urban carbon emissions, is to utilize geothermal. And honestly, in urban places, like, that's where district heating is way more viable, right? So that's one of the things that cities can do. The other thing that they can do is think about the built environment itself. Attached units tend to be more efficient than detached units, right? And those attached units are more common in urban areas. So allowing for denser development, allowing for an urban design that supports transit, that supports walkable neighborhoods. So we're not, we have mixed use. Those are things that cities can do. And it's complicated because the units of analysis are different. We're not talking about megawatt hours necessarily. So once you go beyond electricity space, you've got to broaden, like, how you're thinking about comparability. But there are things that cities can do to contribute, whether we're talking very explicitly in electricity or more broadly. I'll just say, again, from my planning commission experience, we have warehouses that are great potential places for rooftop solar. Yes, there are economies of scale. It can be slightly more expensive than ground-mounted solar, right? But a lot of those costs are actually associated with the permitting side of things. So if we can reduce the cost of local government, building inspections for those, like, this is on the Soul Smart checklist, by the way, that will help accomplish that. But I am not a person who suggests that we need to have policies that ensure a right to the sun. Very often cities will think about, like, solar access ordinances to make sure that solar panels don't get shaded, but really it's to block tall buildings. And in many urban environments, again, that's working at cross purposes with climate goals, where urban density is their contribution to kind of climate action.
So rather than urban areas should produce more renewable energy because there's more people in the urban area, you are proposing that, like, it is not necessary that, but urban area or urban community should also do something and shouldn't put all the pressure into rural community.
Absolutely.
God,
I mean, development is another one, like solar on brownfield, solar on landfills, right? Like it's not the cheapest option. I mean, developers don't do it because first of all, those solar developers, this is not often the first place they look because those properties don't tend to be large. Sometimes you can't tap into the ground. Like there's, and so you have to put the solar panels on ballasts. There's at least sometimes additional hoops you have to jump through, but sometimes a perception that it's just complicated, like contamination on the site makes it complicated. We should, when you ask people though, and we actually, one of the real research things that I do is we just finished a nationwide survey of solar farm neighbors. And when you ask people like brownfield sites, previously disturbed sites, like that's the no-brainer place. Everybody thinks that makes sense. Everybody thinks like rooftop, like maxing out big box stores with rooftop solar carports in parking lots. Like these are the no-brainer things that are urban contributions that we can make. Some of those things can happen through local city governments, but some of them are also utility policies that often are set at the state level. And so there is where it is the local government standing in the way from that rooftop solar or from charging exorbitant fees for building inspections or for electrical inspections for small solar arrays. Like I think that's problematic, and that's where there's a real opportunity for urban places to effectively play their part in this.
Yeah. And I guess before we close it up, I just have one more question. There's one thing you mentioned that is the balance between the rural and the urban community contributions. But also another thing you mentioned is we also need to prioritize the procedural justice, as Biden's administration plan is to, decarbonize the power grid by 2035, and then also we got the net zero emissions by these. I'm wondering, how do we balance the procedural justice and also the urgency of the climate change, of greenhouse gas emissions, all the problem? How do we balance between the two, the time and the justice?
So the balance part of that and like figuring out how actually to operationalize that is the like $1 billion question, or degree climate warming question. Like I would say there's a couple of things that have transpired over the course of the past 6 months that we're trying to look for solutions. So, and I can point you to this. Last fall, we did a series of convenings with Clean Air Task Force here to try to look for bright spots of where this is happening, where things are getting built and communities are excited about them, to figure out like what pathways might be. And the report just came out in January. So one of the ideas that came up was this fair share approach. Another is effectively looking at energy as the solution rather than the problem. So getting communities to proactively plan. Another of the things that we looked at was thinking about the ownership models and how you get communities the benefits of ownership without actually the challenge of like having a community buy into this. But a lot of this it does get to the procedural justice part. But I want to, like, one of the things that I am inspired by, or that makes me feel like maybe I'm not on the wrong side of history in saying like we should care what communities think, is that in the fall, there was a report that came out of the National Academy of Sciences. It's very long. It's like 670 pages. I confess I have not read all of it. But there is a chapter that is specifically on this, and I'm going to read you a quote from it, which says, if permitting reform includes significant reductions in meaningful opportunities for and forms of public engagement, then such reform would create a real risk of slowing rather than hastening the process of building out a net zero infrastructure. I think the punchline here is that we need to think about the long haul, and that doing things against communities' wishes in the short term seems like you're building things. But in the long term, if you have a backlash, which the experts behind the National Academy's report have pulled from other things saying there may well be that, it's not actually the faster path. That doing things with communities procedurally in a procedurally just way ultimately is how we get more in the longer haul. But I agree 100% that like operationalizing that is the tricky part right now. And that's where I've been trying to like brainstorm and come up with like what are better paths.
Thank you so much, Professor Mills. All right, so that was our discussion with Professor Mills. Here in the episode, we explored the renewable energy landscape and how, even though renewable energy is contributing to address the climate crisis, how it is actually causing concerns and problems to the communities, and how local and state governments are trying to address the problems. So, yes, I really hope you liked the episode. But before we sign off, I would want to let you know that we are hosting an event on the February 22nd where we'll be discussing nuclear energy policy and uranium mining extensively. We have a great panel of experts waiting for you. So please sign up and see you there. Thank you so much. Until next time, take care. Bye bye.